Welcome to the WanderLearn show. I'm your host, Tapon. In this episode, I have Robert H. Edwards, also known as Bob Edwards, who wrote a brand new book that's coming out today, June 1st, 2024. It's called Mallory Irvine and Everest. This is a story that happened 100 years ago when two Englishmen set off to climb the tallest mountain on the planet, Mount Everest. And nobody knows whether or not they got there. And he just wrote a book celebrating the 100-year anniversary of their climb and their death. You have to check this out. These guys went on the north side of Everest, which is on the Chinese side, which is the only available side. They went up. They were spotted very high up on the mountain, and then the clouds enveloped them, and nobody knows. They did find the body of Mallory in 1999, but there's no evidence that he made it up to the top of the mountain. This is a fabulous interview. Love the book, and I highly recommend it. Find it in the show notes. And now let's go to Bob Edwards about Mallory. What happened on Everest? Your most plausible theory. I know you don't know. Nobody knows. But what's your best guess?
Francis, well, as you know, I don't know. And I know you would like to put a gun to my head and make me cough up an answer. But let me try to answer your question in a slightly elliptical way. What you're asking for is a statement of probabilities. And I'm a mathematician, so I'm accustomed to dealing with probabilities. And if you permit me just a little bit of context, this book is the second in a series of three, which I like to call a great 20th century mysteries. The first of them was D.B. Cooper and Flight 305, published by Schiffer of Athlin, Pennsylvania. In that case, I had data to work with. I had aeronautical data, I had weather data, I had factual data that I could process and arrive at probabilities. Now, in the case of Mallory, Irvine, and Everest, we are dealing with an almost complete absence of data. And if you're a mathematician and you want to make a probability statement, you do have to have data. What we know about the events of June the 8th, 1924, is extremely limited. But as you know, and as I've written in my book, there is one critical piece of data, and that is this sighting by Noel Odell at 12:50 p.m. on that day of what he believed to be Mallory and Irvine at a point which any reasonable observer would say was what we now call the third step. At that point, they were approximately 600 vertical feet below the summit. Modern climbers know that there is no obstacle of any consequence between the third step and the summit. It is a cakewalk. So,
aside from the lack of oxygen, assuming you have some oxygen or you're acclimatized.
Let's assume that that was not an issue for them. Mallory and Irvine knew that only 4 days prior to that, their colleagues, Norton and Somerville, had climbed to 28,000 feet without oxygen and were not forced to turn back because of oxygen. Furthermore, as we all know, in 1980, or rather 1978, Reinhold Messner and Peter Haberle climbed to the summit without oxygen, and Messner did the same alone in 1980. So, if you like, to make a statement of probabilities with very, very little data, but let's say one point of data that seems reliable, and perhaps reasonable people may disagree, I would say, and I would ask my readers to judge, because at the end of the day, I want my readers to judge, not myself. that there was no obstacle between the sighting of that Noel Odell made and the summit itself.
You say quite clearly in the book that it all hinges on Odell's sighting. And for those who lack the context, Odell was one of the people, the members of the team. He had a telescope. He was looking up to see more or less, and he's seeing these faint little, tiny little dots on the mountain. And those dots could presumably, another interpretation, just be rocks, because Everest is not absolutely covered in snow. And maybe he just misread it. He claimed that they were moving and moving relatively swiftly. So, we got to trust that. And as you say, all bets are off if we discard his sighting, right?
That's correct. If you discard the sighting, then all bets are off. However, I think I should respond to what you just said about that they could be rocks. Odell did have an optical instrument. It's not really clear whether it was a telescope or binoculars. More likely, it would have been binoculars. In either case, probably he would have had a magnification of about 5-1. That would be typical in those days for binoculars that you would carry on a field trip. At that magnification, a man of 6 feet would have looked about a quarter the size, a quarter the vertical height of the full moon. You know what the full moon looks like. You see it every day in the sky.
Right.
You take a quarter of that diameter, that would be the image, the visual image that Odell would have with an optical instrument of 5-1. There was a narrative that arose, I think in the 1930s, which attempted to discredit Odell on the grounds that what he had seen was rocks or birds. But I think that was a self-interested narrative. And I don't think that there's any justification for such a narrative.
Okay, fair enough. Now, one of the other big stumbling blocks, literally, is the second step. For those who don't know, on the north face of Everest, you have to go up 3 steps, and the second one is the most gnarly one. And there's been since I think 1975, I could be wrong, the Chinese ladder that has been the way to go up there, literally a ladder. Obviously, Mallory and Irvine, the people doing this exactly 100 years ago today, would not have had the benefit of such a ladder. They would have nothing. And a lot of people question whether he would have been able to do so. Now, Conrad Anker, who was a premier elite mountaineer, went up that mount, and he estimated it was a 5.10 on the climbing scale. And the question is could Mallory and Irvine was not nearly as experienced as a mountaineer. Could Mallory have done that and then hauled Irvine up for that second step? Technically, is there anything that would have stopped him?
Here again, my answer is I don't know. Secondly, I am not a mountaineer. I have no qualification to express a view about any mountaineer, living or dead, to have done any specific climb whatsoever. It is simply outside my expertise. Mm-hmm. However, more to the point, you, I think, in posing this question to me, have made the assumption that Mallory and Irvine attempted to climb the second step.
True.
And this is an assumption which many modern mountaineers make. There is no basis for this assumption whatsoever.
But I think in your book you mentioned that Reinhold Messner, the guy who went up Everest twice without oxygen, I think it's on his second attempt, he kind of went laterally across the mountain and then just a bit of surge without oxygen to spend as little time as possible in the death zone. And so presumably he's just dodged the whole second step altogether.
Yes, Reinhold Messner never went anywhere near the second step. He had a different strategy, a different approach to the mountain whatsoever. And as we all know, he was successful. As I say, you are making an assumption. Other people have made an assumption. A large part of that assumption is based on the fact that almost all, possibly all, modern mountaineers who climb Everest by the north face use the second step.
True.
And they do so for the reason that you say, because the Chinese ladder is there. However, the fact that modern mountaineers do so, and in fact they do so by orders of the Chinese government, no other route is permitted.
Without permission, probably.
And that permission is never given.
Mm-hmm.
The Chinese government does not give permission at any time for a route other than the approved route, which takes the second step. So the fact that modern mountaineers take the second step tells us nothing about what Mallory and Irvine might or might not have done. One, I think, final point that I have to make here, having read, I would say, the entirety of Mallory's writings of relevance to this climb, is that Mallory never once, in all his writings, mentioned either the second step or indeed any step on Everest. He never once used the term second step. He never once used the term first step. And the term third step did not exist in those days. It was not part of the climber's vocabulary. What Mallory did say in writing was that he thought the North Ridge, correct me, the Northeast Ridge was impossible. It was excluded from his thoughts. He said this twice in correspondence with people to whom he wrote. So to try to answer your question, I think your question is, it's what they used to say in Perry Mason. Objection, Your Honor. Sustained.
What about the ice axe? Tell us about the famous ice axe that was found.
Okay, the ice axe, which was found by Percy Wynne Harris on the May 27th, 1933. I have seen this ice axe. I've had it in front of me at the Alpine Club in London, sitting on a table. I spent probably a good half an hour looking at it. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to leave any fingerprints or contamination on it, because who knows whether DNA technology in the future might tell us who had handled that ice axe.
True.
But I did look at it. I was not allowed to take photographs. It's that ice axe is copyright, and images of the ice axe belong to the Alpine Club. But I looked at it. My first reaction was, this is extremely short. This axe is way short. I didn't think at the time to measure it, but later on, I corresponded with the librarian at the Alpine Club, and she very kindly measured it for me. She came back and told me it's 3 foot 1.5 inches, 37.5 inches. Later on, I corresponded with Shrewsbury School in England, where they have a room called the Irvine Room. And in that room, there is an ice axe, which undoubtedly belonged to Irvine. It was one of his personal ice axes. It was returned to his family after his death. They later on gave it to the school. That axe is 43.5 inches long. It's 6 inches longer than the ice axe in the Alpine Club. So right there you have, let's say, an anomaly. Would a man who was 6'1" or 6'2", he was a big guy,
Yes.
Irvine.
Yes.
Would he have a personal ice axe that was 43.5 inches long and another that was 37.5? He had to buy these axes, and he paid his own money for them. I think, and again, I'm going to try and cut a long story short because I know we need to move on. For me, the narrative which makes the most sense, which is most plausible, is that of Percy Wynne Harris himself. He wrote his memoirs in 1978 for his grandchildren. They were never published, but they are held in the Alpine Club in London. They were kind to send me copies of the relevant pages. Wynne Harris was very clear. He said this axe was not a personal axe. This was a communal axe issued to the expedition, probably intended mainly for the use of porters. He furthermore believed that the marks that were later found on the ice axe, which I myself saw in London, were marks made on his instructions by his porter in order to distinguish this axe from any other axe, because Wyn Harris recognized the historical significance of the axe. Long story short, I think this was an axe that Mallory or Irvine had on them as a spare for who knows what reason, probably originally intended for a porter, but they had it on them. And I think it's most plausible that they left it there. They placed it there. One of them placed it there, probably as a marker. Let's say possibly as a marker. Maybe it was just an unnecessary encumbrance and they put it down. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that it was a marker for something. If so, it could have been a marker for one of the oxygen bottles, such as the number 9 bottle, which was found about 15 meters away in 1999. Or it was a marker for a route of some kind. It was a marker to tell them that this is a place where we probably either want to ascend or descend. Let's leave this ice axe here. We don't need it. Let's put it down.
Right, because it was found in a very strange place that would not be a typical place where you would have fallen or slipped, and it was just standing there as if it was just placed, as opposed to, halfway down the mountain or something like that. It was in a very stable area where you wouldn't necessarily fall. It's not a high risk area, so that your logic there makes a lot of sense. The other thing that you could use such an ice axe for is not just as a backup, but also as a way to, for a tent stake, in other words, to keep something down, or as you say, a marker. I understand your logic there. You also mentioned that Mallory had a tendency to not keep a reserve. In other words, a reserve inside of himself. I'm not talking about a reserve ice axe, but a reserve of just energy, which is critical in mountaineering. You have to have some sort of reserve for emergencies because you never know when you need it. And he tended to push himself to the utter brink. Talk about that and where that may have gone wrong.
Francis, I'm not sure that I actually said that in my book. I think you might be putting words into my mouth.
Okay, sorry, I apologize. I thought I read that, but you could be right. You know what you wrote in your book much better than I do, so I'm going to take that back.
I like to think I do, but let me try to respond to what you say. I would say that Mallory, the way I read Mallory's climbs, and I'm speaking of 21, 22, and 24, I would say that he was aware of what could and could not be done physically. I don't think I have seen any evidence that Mallory pushed his body beyond its limits. I can give you a number of examples. Let's take, for example, the 1921 climb, which was the first of the three. He reached the North Col. He looked at the North Ridge, which clearly was the route to the summit, and he pondered, should we try for another 500 feet? We can obviously do that. And he decided no. That's documented in the book of the expedition. It was something he could have done, but he said, no, there's no point. Nothing will be achieved by that extra 500 feet. Second example, the climb of 1922, he with Norton and Somerville reached 26,985 feet on the North Ridge. Again, they had no doubt that they could do another probably 300 feet. I don't know who made the decision exactly, but I think the decision was agreed. Mallory tended to be the decision maker in these circumstances, I feel. So I'm inclined to the view that Mallory said, this is as far as we need to go. We could go further, but this doesn't make sense. Let's turn back, which they did.
Mhm.
So I think there are at least two examples of cases where Mallory made a decision to turn back, to turn around, when he could have gone further. So I'm not an adherent of the narrative that he was like a go for broke, uh, what we say in French, jusqu'au boutiste. He was not a jusqu'au boutiste. Um, I think that's the best I can say, Francis.
Fair enough.
I don't think that he would break the body. He would sometimes take risks. He took risks with frostbite. There is an example which I narrated about where he became impatient, took off his gloves, started cutting steps. I think it was 922, and got a little bit of frostbite. Not too bad. And afterwards realized that that had been stupid.
Right. Speaking about stupid, was it stupid to not select Finch, which was an accomplished climber, and instead he decided his climbing partner would be this 21-year-old robust man named Irvine, who is good for the oxygen tanks and an engineer of sorts, but not necessarily the guy you want to climb the tallest mountain in the world that had never been climbed before. And Finch, by many other accounts, would have been a far better option, which is kind of what you alluded to in the book. But it seems like personality struggles perhaps was the difference that made him pick Irvine. What do you think?
Okay, Francis, you have a misconception here. Finch was not selected for 1924 at all.
Hmm.
He was not on that expedition at all. He had been, let's say, deselected by the Mount Everest Committee. So, although it appears that he wished to be on the expedition, he was not on the expedition at all. The choice that Mallory made in 1924 was not between Finch and Irvine, it was between Odell and Irvine.
I see. Okay. Thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah, the alternative to Irvine was Odell. And here I would have to say it was a bad call.
Was Finch a better climber than Odell?
On track record, you would have to say yes. In 1924, Odell was unproven. On June the 8th, 1924, Mallory would have known nothing about what Odell was capable of. Odell had been, I think, not higher than Camp 5, which was 25,000 feet. That's all that Mallory knew about Odell. Whereas Mallory would have known from 1922 that Finch had been to 27,000 feet and could have gone higher, except for the accident with Bruce. So Mallory, I'm sure, would have viewed Finch as a much better climber than either Odell, and of course, incomparably better than Irvine. However, that choice was not available to Mallory because Finch was not there.
Understood now. But do you think it was wrong to not pick Odell?
Yes, it was wrong. I would say that Norton, Colonel Edward Norton, attempted to make this point to Mallory on the evening of June the 4th, when Norton and Somerville returned in a state of terminal exhaustion from their climb. Norton was snowblind. He literally could not see. He shared a tent with Mallory on that night. And in the course of that evening and night, Mallory sprung it on him that Mallory intended to climb with Irvine, and Norton, in a very English way, which you can detect in his writings, was clearly shocked. This is very understated in the accounts, but you can see that Norton tried very hard to persuade Mallory not to take Irvine, but to take Odell. And Mallory declined. Norton was in no shape to argue. Had Mallory chosen Odell, I think history would have been very different.
Interesting. So they might have made a round trip. Do you think that if Irving died on the way up, that Mallory would have continued without him?
I would say for me, it's impossible to answer that question. You're really asking me to reconstruct the personality, the character, the motivations of Mallory. And Mallory is, he died 100 years ago. I have only his writings coming across a century to inform me about who and what he was. The only precedent, I think, if you like, I can suggest, how did Mallory react to a death on the mountain? There was only one previous incident. That was in 1922, when the 7 porters died in an avalanche. Mm-hmm. And it was on Mallory's watch. You could even say Mallory was has to take some of the responsibility for that accident. Mallory was devastated. It shows up in his writings. He attempted to save the men, those who were already dead. There was nothing he could do. Those that were still alive, he did his best to rescue them. That's really about all I could say. We have no reason to believe that Irvine died on the way up. There's no logical reason why that should be the case. There is no obstacle between, as I said, between the third step and the summit. Irvine was a young man, fit, strong. Nobody falls on that stretch of the mountain. Nobody in good health dies absent a fall on that mountain. So the whole concept of Irvine dying on the way up seems to me very, very implausible.
And yet, we have about 5 minutes remaining, and I just want to catch up a few other points. His body was, some people think he was found by the Chinese that said that they found an Englishman there. I think it was Wang who discovered it. And what I don't understand is how then the body would just disappear, assuming that the sighting was accurate.
Well, that's correct. In May 1960, Wang Fuzhou, a member of the Chinese Summit Party. Let me back up a little bit. Wang Fuzhou and his 3 companions were on the Summit Party, which, as we know, they claimed to have succeeded. Nothing at that time was said in the Chinese accounts about the body of a European. It was not until 5 years later, at a meeting of the Soviet Geographical Society in Leningrad, as it was, that it was reported that Wang Fuzhou had said, at 8,600 meters, we saw the body of a European. Somebody in the audience at the end of the speech asked him, how do you know it was a European? And he said he was wearing braces or suspenders And that's how I knew. For me, it's one of the most extraordinary statements ever made about Everest. Not so much the statement itself, but the fact that in almost 60 years, that statement has never been either challenged or repudiated or confirmed. That body at 8,600 meters clearly could not be Mallory, who, as we all know, was found elsewhere on the mountain. Therefore, if Wang Fuzhou saw a European, it could only be, I could qualify this, but to keep things simple, I won't. It could only be Irvine. Why, now you ask, why would that body not have been seen ever again by all the thousands of climbers who have taken the Northeast Ridge route? Okay, I don't have an answer. I have never set foot on Everest. I can only, if you like, trying to juggle the probabilities. I have the feeling that the modern route is very, very narrowly defined. It's literally a few feet wide. It's on fixed ropes. You do not stray from it to right or to left, and you are not allowed to do so. And the Sherpas who normally are with you will make sure you do not. So I think that the question, why has that body not ever been seen again, is not so hard of a question to trip us up. If there's a body as much as 50 feet from the modern route, and if that body is behind a rock, if it is covered in snow, and snow is very often permanent on Everest, that body may still be there.
Maybe global warming will melt the ice caps there. Whatever remaining ice, and it will reveal it more obviously. Fascinating book that you have. I really recommend it for anybody who's even remotely interested in the Mallory Irvine Everest saga. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
To read the book. For those who want to dive into the details, we have just skimmed the absolute surface. It is an incredibly well-researched book that dives into all the nitty-gritty details about this 100-year-old mystery that we're celebrating today, June 1st, 2024, of Mallory's and Irving's attempt and depth on Everest. And I highly recommend getting there. Thank you so much for writing this book, Bob.
Thank you very much, Francis, for your kind words. And thank you very much for having me on the show. It's been a real pleasure. I hope that your listeners will be informed, educated, inspired, and perhaps will be motivated to form their own view about what we've discussed.
That is what I love about the book, is that you don't impose your viewpoint at all. You just share the facts. You share the probabilities like a mathematician. And I think that's a wonderful way for let the reader decide what really happened on that fateful day 100 years ago. Again, thank you again, Rob. And I'll put a link in the show notes to how to purchase the book. And I wish you the best.
Thank you, Francis. Thank you.
And that ends this episode of the WanderLearn podcast, where we explore travel, technology, and transformation. If you'd like to see the show notes with links to what we've talked about, go to wanderlearn.com and click on this episode. If you'd like to connect with me, just remember Tapon. That's my first initial and my last name. Tapon is always my social media username. My website is ftapon.com. Do you want to leave me an anonymous voicemail where you can make a comment or ask a question? Then go to speakpipe.com/ftapon. Furthermore, if you'd like to get rewarded for supporting my projects, then go to patreon.com/ftapon. That's where you can pick up some remarkable rewards for as little as $2 a month. Now, 5 quick favors. Number 1, subscribe to the WanderLearn podcast. 2, download it. 3, share it. 4, review it. And 5, sign up for my newsletter at wanderlearn.com. Our theme music was composed by Eric Stratman. This is Francis Tapon, encouraging you to wander and learn.